أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين فاطر السماوات والأرضين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل في القرآن المجيد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is a blessing of Allah that we have this opportunity to come together in a unique format. We have a majlis, which is first and foremost a gathering and a commemoration dedicated to honoring and remembering the example and the sacrifice of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. And that is a ritual and institution which is not only for our intellect to increase our knowledge and our understanding, but for our soul to increase our commitment and our desire to follow in the path of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad alayhimus salatu wassalam. But at the same time, it is an opportunity for us to learn and to explore topics that are relevant to our daily lives. And so, inshallah, through this hybrid format, I will try to briefly during the majlis introduce a few general concepts that will inform us about the basis of our Islamic understanding of economic responsibilities that we as individuals and as a collective have. And then after the conclusion of the majlis, we will have an extended question-answer time, which will permit us, inshallah, to look at some of the more specific issues and details of those general principles so that we can get more concrete answers and also avenues for further study and research. So to begin, the framing of the contrast between competing economic systems is often presented as the two extremes of socialism and capitalism, with socialism representing the idea that what is primary is society, and therefore the freedom of the individual sometimes should be limited or compromised in order to ensure the greatest good of society. And of course, that depends on how a collective may define the greatest good of society, but generally, a socialist system will look towards reducing inequality, reducing absolute poverty, and ensuring that even the most underprivileged and poor members of society have access to their basic material needs, education, healthcare, shelter, in some cases perhaps basic employment, and so on. So the underlying philosophy is that the primary unit that we should be concerned about ensuring the rights and the interests of is society or the collective. And on the other extreme, we often have a capitalist system, which is rooted in individual rights and interests, and the idea that I, as an individual, should be allowed to work for my self-interest and often for a profit. And if everyone as an individual works for their own individual self-interest, that maximizes freedom and liberty, and it also produces the greatest good for society. The collective is also going to benefit because my acting in my individual self-interest means that I will allocate my capital, whether it be material or intellectual capital or non-material capital, in the most efficient way in order to achieve profit. And when the profit of society is maximized, the productivity of society goes up, and that produces material benefits to all members of society, even those who may not have a great deal of material wealth and capital. But when that tide rises, then all of the boats in the harbor, they are lifted. So in a pure sense, we can say that there is one extreme of socialism, which views society as the primary unit of our legal and moral obligations. And the other is capitalism, which looks at the individual and the self-interest of the individual as the primary unit of our intellectual and legal obligations. And therefore, the role of government in a socialist system will be to ensure that society has those collective interests being met. And therefore, the government would be expected in a socialist system to take an active role in the economy and in society by owning the means of production or by heavily regulating the economic output of different actors in society, individuals, corporations. If there is private ownership, then it would be heavily regulated and perhaps heavily taxed. Whereas in a capitalist system, the expected role of government would be primarily to ensure that individual liberty is not compromised, meaning that I don't exercise force to compel you to do something that is against your conscience or against your self-interest or against your desire. So the role of government is not to regulate how I or you will use your property or what economic decisions you will make or how much profit you are going to earn, but to make sure that I don't infringe upon your individual liberties and rights and that you don't infringe on my rights and my liberties. That's a simplification, of course, but I wanted to draw that contrast in order to give us a sense of those two extremes as they are often understood. The point that is the starting of our Islamic understanding of humanity, and therefore the roles that we play as human beings, is that Islam does not consider these two to be two extremes. Continuum to say, is it the collective or the individual? Is it the role of government to determine or regulate society, or is it the role of government to prevent force and injustice by one individual actor against another individual actor? These two might seem to us to be two extremes, the two ends of the continuum, but really they are both on the same side. And there is another extreme, or there is another measure of the true nature of society, and that is where Islam stands. So taking the division as I have described it, between an extreme collective focus and an extreme individual focus, Islam lies somewhere in the middle. As we've said, we generally don't have pure socialist societies, and we don't have pure capitalist societies. We often have a welfare state where there is a provision for basic necessities for members of society, but there is also a wide space for profit motivation and for individual economic activity. Within those two extremes that I described, Islam also will lie somewhere in the middle, and it will bear some similarities to that individual, that welfare state. But the reason why Islam lies in the middle is that Islam does not accept that continuum as a whole. What Islam says is that it is a mistake to think that people are primarily economic beings, or that people are primarily material beings. That it is a natural state for us to seek to maximize our economic interest or our material self-interest. That the profit motive is the basis of all of our decision-making. Islam negates the idea that this is the natural state of humanity, or that this is the ideal state of humanity. And whether we look at the ideal or the pure capitalist society, or the ideal or the pure socialist society, what we see is that both of them are characterized by a focus on the material or the economic aspect of human existence. It's not always economic, but at the very least, the material aspect of human existence. What Islam tells us is that our economic and our material role is an important part of who we are and what our responsibilities and our needs are. But it comes after our role as spiritual beings and the primary reality of our existence, the primary source of our needs as human beings, and the primary source of our responsibilities and our rights are not material and economic, but rather they are divine in origin, they are spiritual, or they are religious. So when Islam tells us that you are not primarily an economic being, you are not primarily a material being, what it means is that the natural units of society, which are going to define our politics and our economics and our social interactions, are not going to be defined just by what allows for material or economic progress, but there is a more fundamental level. And let me give an example. Some of you may be old enough to remember way back in the year 2008, in the presidential election at that time, Barack Obama was not yet the president, he was a candidate for president. And in a fundraiser, I believe it was in April of 2008, and perhaps in a fundraiser in San Francisco, Obama spoke about certain voters clinging to their guns and their religion and voting against their own interests. And that is a belief that many people, many progressives, many intellectuals in America had at the time, and perhaps have even today, that a number of voters in America are too ignorant or too prejudiced to understand their own self-interest. And therefore, they'll vote for, say, the Republican Party that may lower taxes on the wealthy, that may reduce social spending, which many of those voters benefit from and need, because many of them depend on Medicare in their old age. Many of them depend on other forms of government assistance. Many of them may have jobs that have benefited from unionization and regulation, especially those from a working class background. So the idea is that these people are voting against their own interest by voting for the party or the candidate that is going to reduce the regulations that help them economically, and by lowering taxes on a group of people that these voters are never going to be a part of. But this is the mistake in the thinking. This is the conceit and the arrogance in that thinking. Who gets to define what my interest is? If I see a candidate who agrees with me on cultural issues, and perhaps I also know that that candidate is not in agreement with me on economic interests, on economic issues. If I decide that I value that agreement on cultural issues more than I value my material or my economic self-interest, then nobody can say from a material perspective that I have voted against my own interests. Because in a capitalist society, it is the individual that determines their own self-interest. And so if I utilize my land in a way that you might call inefficient or unproductive, if it's my property in a capitalist society, as long as, in a pure capitalist society, as long as I'm not using it in a way that pollutes your land, as long as I'm not using it in a way that contradicts your rights, nobody can say that I am doing anything wrong. The utility, the profit that I seek from that land is to keep it undeveloped or to keep it underdeveloped. That's not against my interest, because that is what makes me happy. That is what my desire is. So this idea that religious voters or pro-gun voters are voting against their self-interest is based on the idea that a progressive or an intellectual can determine for a person what their self-interest is. And it's rooted in the idea that maximizing their income or maximizing their wealth or maximizing their economic self-interest is the true interest of that person. And therefore, if they act or if they vote in a way that gives them some other benefit, perhaps a political benefit, perhaps a cultural benefit, but is against their economic interest, they're voting against their true interest. And some of us may have experienced that clash, that disconnect in society. But the reality is that human beings are not reducible to their economic well-being. Human beings cannot be reduced to material self-interest. And this is where the insight that we get from Islam tells us that our true existence and our true identity is spiritual. And that is why the Quran says that Allah has made us shu'uban wa qaba'ila. Allah has made us into tribes and nations and ethnic groups, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that we can get to know one another, because it is through the diversity of complexion, of physical features, of languages, of cultures, that we are able to distinguish our own identity and distinguish each other. But inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, the true basis of our relationship to Allah, the true basis of our humanity is taqwa. It's rooted in values. And atqakum, or taqwa, piety, refers to that spiritual element. So the first insight that we have from Islam is that the two extremes are not collective versus individual. The two ends of the continuum, the two possible choices, are material versus spiritual origin of our rights and our needs as a human being. And on this continuum, it is the spiritual primacy that is true. So the truth is that we are primarily spiritual beings, not material beings. However, when we say that we are primarily spiritual beings, this can be taken in several different ways. One way for me to understand that I am primarily a spiritual being is that then I should run away from material attachments. So I become more spiritual if I don't get married, if I don't get a job and a career and try to maximize my earning potential, or get a promotion and come to a high position in my career, or I don't have political ambitions and material ambitions. If I stay away from the world and I worship, for example, or I don't get married, I don't have kids, I keep an individual existence, that is what is going to give me the greatest spirituality. So if I say that what is primary about my existence is spirituality, one understanding of that, which is monasticism of various forms that is found in many religions, but has been negated by Islam. La ruhbaniyata fil Islam is a hadith of our Prophet Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alih. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Monasticism is that idea that because we are primarily spiritual beings, you achieve enlightenment, you achieve salvation, you achieve your full potential as a human being by running away from the material world. And therefore, if you don't have a career, if you don't have a spouse, if you don't have a family, if you don't have political responsibilities to distract you, then you will be a more enlightened and a more spiritual human being. Islam rejects that. Islam rejects the idea of monasticism, and Islam rejects the idea that the primacy of our spiritual being means that we should ignore or we should put in second priority our material existence. Instead, Islam gives us a slightly different perspective. It says that the primacy of our spiritual being is honored by living in the material world for a spiritual purpose. So we live in the material world without being of the material world. Meaning, I do get a job and I do try to maximize my earning potential. I do care about education. I do care about ensuring that the material circumstances of myself and my family and my Muslim community are as strong as the material circumstances of other religious communities. And I want to maximize the power, economic and political power of Muslims, but not for the sake of economic power and not for the sake of spiritual power, because that would mean that I am living in this world and of this world. But rather, I want to maximize that earning potential, that influence, and all of those factors in order to serve a moral purpose. I live in this world, but this world is a means to serve a spiritual purpose. It's a means to serve the hereafter. I am in, but not of this world. And therefore, there is a balance that Islam wants us to achieve. The continuum is not between individual capitalist, and collective or socialist. The continuum is between material, and both capitalism and socialism in this conception will fall somewhere within that material realm. The balance is between a material existence and a spiritual existence. But Islam's synthesis is that to live a purely material existence is to deny the soul and what truly makes us human, which is the conscience, the soul that is given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then Allah has given that soul, and Allah has breathed that soul into a material body. And so if my conception of spirituality is monastic, if my spiritual conception means that I am fleeing from this world and from the means of material advancement, then I am also doing a disservice. In this case, because Allah has wedded our soul to a body, and I am caring about the soul, but not about the body. In reality, I'm doing an injustice to my body and to my soul, because Allah has placed that soul within a body. So getting married and having a family and getting an education that's beneficial for my material well-being, and then becoming a good steward of the material world. And inshallah, in the question answer period, we'll talk a little bit about the Islamic view of environmentalism. All of these are part of what my body needs, but also what my soul needs. So that is the conceptual framework that we need to have. Don't think of individual versus collective good. Don't think of capitalism versus socialism as the real key or defining contrast. Think of material versus spiritual as the defining contrast. And on that end, it is the spiritual that is primary, but not the spirit as if it exists independently of the body. The spirit that Allah, in His wisdom, has put in a material body, and therefore the material existence that we have been gifted by Allah is the means for our spiritual goals and attainment. So what does that mean on a practical level? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As I said earlier, what that means is that Islam is going to lie somewhere between the individual and the collective focus, but in a unique way. Islam is going to lie between those, not because it's trying to achieve just stability or balance between a socialist system, which takes care of the vulnerable and the poor, and a capitalist system, which can often lead to inequality, instability, and then perhaps violent rebellion or revolution. It's not stability that motivates the combination of socialist and capitalist elements. It's not the political contention that we find, within the economic and political history of most countries that goes from, say, a hands-off government, a laissez-faire government, to a more regulatory and a more involved government. The reason why Islam combines those two elements is because Islam believes that since it is the moral aspect of our existence that is primary, and that gives meaning and breathes life into our material and our physical existence, then those things that have a moral existence deserve to be reflected within our politics and within our economy as a matter of truth and justice. Those things that have moral relevance deserve to be recognized in society, in the economy, in politics, and in law. And in that case, Islam says that to view the interests of the collective by themselves is not true, because Allah has given us an individual existence and an individual conscience. So it's false for me to plan for the collective and not to recognize that the way you see the world, what motivates you to learn, to engage in economic activity, might be different from what motivates me. Maybe I want to earn a little bit of money and spend it right away, and you want to earn money and save it because you derive satisfaction not from the spending of money or the consumption of goods, but from knowing that you have a certain amount of money in the bank. What motivates you might be different from me, whether it be in the economic sphere or in other areas of life. And to ignore that individual reality, our individual conscience, and our individual existence, is to deny God's creation. The individual and the individual conscience is real, and therefore the rights of the individual need to be reflected in the Islamic system of economy. And that's why private property and the profit motive have been recognized within the Islamic system. But here is where Islam differs from a capitalist society. Islam rejects the idea that all that is real is the individual. When we get together in society, we create myths, we create narratives, we create a certain force of history that is greater than the individual parts. And if we develop a collective that has a history of and a precedent of doing things in a certain way, that can be an incredible force for good or for evil that is separate from our individual motivations and our individual abilities. The idea that individual self-interest always produces the greatest good is wrong. And in fact, that individual self-interest cannot just be added together and then we think that the sum of those individual parts for good or for evil is what the collective will be. Not only can we not say that sum is ideal, but we can't even say that the sum of the individual parts is what the collective is going to be. The collective then acquires an identity of its own, and it's not just reducible to individual actions. So just like it is wrong to say that what is primary or what is real is the collective and not the individual, it is similarly wrong to say that what is real is the individual and not the collective. And this is why the Quran speaks of collective responsibility. The Quran addresses the Jews in Surah Al-Baqarah, فَلِمَ تَقْتُلُونَ أَنْبِيَاءَ اللَّهِ مِنْ قَبْلُ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Why do you kill the prophets of God? And this was a verse of Quran revealed in the time of Prophet Muhammad that had been more than 2,000 years. At the very least, more than 1,000 years before the children of Israel had killed any of their prophets. But the Quran considers there to be a moral continuity because they still held on to the ethnic and religious identity and values that legitimized those actions against their prophets and against the moral message of their prophets. That continuity and that reality of our social, our collective existence is recognized in the Quran. So the well-being of the individual and the well-being of society both are real. They both have a moral effect on our life, and both of them need to be recognized. And this is why we find within the tradition of Ahlul Bayt that it is so highly emphasized to remember the sacrifice of Imam Hussein and the martyrs of Karbala, because we don't believe that was a historical incident. We believe that Imam Hussein alayhi salam took a stand for justice. And his movement was to say that justice is not just about ensuring that Arabs do not oppress non-Arabs, or that the upper class and wealthy do not oppress the lower class and the poor. Justice means taking a stand for what is true, for serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and for sacrifice. And because the mission of Imam Hussein was intimately tied to justice, it is a mission that is beyond history, beyond the individual circumstances of the life of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. The focus of our previous prophets before Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa was never to be seen in isolation. And that is a mistake that was sometimes made by followers of those religions, where, for example, they look at the New Testament as if that is the essence of the message of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, almost as if the New Testament, without whatever questions we may have about authenticity separate. But even if we assume the New Testament is an authentic reflection of the teachings of Prophet Isa, it was never intended to be an abrogation or a refutation of the message contained in the Torah, in what is by and large known as the Old Testament by Christians. In other words, Prophet Isa alayhi salam, if he preached a message that seems to have certain similarities with socialism, that is because his goal was to correct the extremes that the children of Israel had gone to by misunderstanding or by misapplying the message of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. They had been given a law, but they turned the law into legalism. And the law of Prophet Musa alayhi salam was never meant to be a legalistic system. It was never meant to undermine morality by means of legal stratagems. And so to correct that extreme, Prophet Isa alayhi salam taught a message that focused on the spirit of the law, the moral force of the law and of our actions as human beings. If we see this in isolation, then it might seem as if this was kind of leaning towards a non-shari or non-legal focus, but also perhaps towards what we would characterize today perhaps as a socialist focus. And the proper way to understand the message of Prophet Isa is that it was a corrective to the mistakes being made deliberately or inadvertently by the children of Israel in applying the message of Prophet Musa. But that message originally and that message as it was actually taught by Prophet Isa had both a legal and a moral component, and it did preserve the well-being of the individual and also of the society. So it wasn't leaning in one direction. And this is also true within our own Islamic history as well. We don't believe, as the Quran says, that Prophet Muhammad ma kuntu bid'an min ar-rusul. He was not a new prophet. He was not bringing a new message. It was the same message that was brought by the previous prophets. It was refined in line with the final installment of the divine message, and it provided a correction to the alterations and the deviations that had crept into the practice of previous religious communities. Within the Islamic tradition, sometimes people call companions like Abu Dhar as socialists or proto-socialists because they also spoke out against the economic excesses and the political excesses of the governments of their time, in particular during the time of the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan. But the reality is that our standard is Ahlul Bayt. And Ahlul Bayt, alayhimus salatu wassalam, like the Quran, never condemned wealth, never advocated poverty. They condemned people who were distracted by wealth. Alhaakum takathur, as the verses that I recited in the beginning of the speech say. We are distracted by trying to accumulate more and more material wealth. This is what the Quran condemns. This is what Ahlul Bayt condemn. But it is not the case that a person who is wealthy is deprived of salvation, nor is it the case that a person who is poor is closer to salvation. Every one of us have been given a certain test by Allah. Every one of us is a moral agent based on the circumstances that Allah has put us in and the test that He has given us. So Prophet Isa was not socialist. Abu Dhar also was not socialist, but Abu Dhar is not the standard. The standard is whether the history that we find, the statements that we find from Abu Dhar, may Allah's mercy be with him, and other companions reflects the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. And in the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, the wealthy were not condemned because they were wealthy. They were condemned if and when they used their wealth in a way that contravened the commandments of Allah. In fact, there are ahadith that tell us that when there is wealth in society, it is the goal of Islam, and it should be the goal of believers to have as much of that wealth as possible be in the control of believers, because they will use it justly. They will not use it on consumption and for their own personal whims in a destructive and in an immoral way, but they will use it in order to serve Allah, in order to help others who are more needy. It's good for them to be wealthy insofar as they will use that wealth in a humble and in a moral way. So that is the general standard that we have. The reason why people misunderstand the message of some prophets, and also why they sometimes misunderstand, for example, the personality of a person like Abu Dhar, may Allah's blessings be with him, is because they see that in isolation from the teaching of the prophets who came before or the teaching of Ahlul Bayt, whom Abu Dhar was a follower and a loyal companion of. When we see the full context, we find that the balance that I spoke of is well preserved in the words and in the practices of Ahlul Bayt. With regard to monopolization, there is a prohibition of monopolistic practices and exploitative prices when it comes to necessities in society. And that's discussed in classical books of fiqh under the heading of ihtikar, to hoard or to monopolize things that Muslims need for their basic livelihood. So those things must be kept available, and they must be kept affordable to the masses. And that is an individual responsibility for each and every one of us. And it is also a collective responsibility for the government. And the general principle there is that it is a requirement for the government to prevent that hoarding or that monopolization with a minimal intervention that allows people to have access to their needs. So for example, if there is a shortage of rice and people need rice, then the Islamic government should compel me to sell the rice, but it won't set a price. I can sell that rice at a market price, but I should not be allowed to hoard it in the hope of greater profit in the future. It should come into the market, but that minimum intervention that forces me, that compels me not to hoard, but that allows the price to be set by the market. Now, in certain cases, that minimal level of intervention might not be sufficient to ensure that people have access to their basic needs, and there might be a greater level of intervention that's required. But that is something that is permitted And in fact, it is a responsibility, both at the individual level and at the collective or at the government level. Now, when it comes to things that are not a need, is it permissible to have a monopoly of a luxury item? That is something that is not so clear-cut in Islamic law, and because people can elect not to take advantage of that luxury, then it may be a little bit more difficult to establish a right of intervention for an Islamic government. But perhaps I'll address that from another aspect in some of the other questions that come in a moment. The next question was about the environment, and Islam teaches us that we don't have intrinsic rights as a human being. We don't even own our own existence. So it's not my life, and I can't use my life as I want. It's God's life. The body and the soul are both created by Allah. They have been gifted to me for a limited time, and therefore my responsibilities come before my rights. Responsibilities are given to me by Allah, and the rights are given to me by Allah. They're not intrinsic to me, but they are granted by Allah. And some of those rights and responsibilities, they're given to us in revealed law. Some of those rights and responsibilities are so fundamental that Allah has placed them within my fitra itself, within my human nature and my intellect. And even people who don't believe in God or don't believe in religion, they understand those basic rights. But the rights, even if I don't understand them through Scripture, even if I understand them independently of Scripture, those rights are still conferred upon me by Allah, conferred by the act of God's creation and by the mercy of His creation. Therefore, we have a responsibility alongside every right that we have been given by God. And one of those responsibilities is to be a steward of God's creation. So taking care of the environment and taking care of the rights of everything within God's creation, including animals, including plants, including the ecosystem in which we live, is a responsibility that we as human beings have by virtue of the fact that we are creatures of God, and that ecosystem, the plants and the animals and everything else that exists, is also a creature, a creation of God. Now, how does that work? Well, from the school of Ahlul Bayt, the belief is that there are certain limits on how we can use our private property, because again, that ownership that we have is a gift by Allah. We're not real owners. Allah is yarithul arda wa ma fiha. He is the heir of the earth and everything in it. We just have a temporary and a figurative attachment and an ownership of certain things for our lifespan. And then it passes on to our heirs, and eventually it passes outside of our own control and our families and our descendants' control, and Allah is the warith. He is the heir of all that exists. In reality, it was His ownership all along. So we have limits on how we can use our property, and that which is not owned by anyone else, in general, minerals, undeveloped land, like islands in the ocean, mountain peaks, forests, and so on, they by and large come under the rubric of Al-Anfal in Islamic law. And there's a Surat Al-Anfal in the Quran as well. Al-Anfal are the property of the Ma'asum, so Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, and then each of the Imams after the Prophet. And of course, the Anfal, those public properties, we can say, they don't belong to the public. They belong to the Ma'asum. The Ma'asum will then give permission to the public to use them in line with the sustainable and the optimum use of those assets. And of course, today when the Imam is not present, then that would be the responsibility of an Islamic state or an Islamic jurist to define the parameters of the usage of those resources in consultation with people who have the necessary expertise in the relevant scientific fields. However, the basis is that everything that exists is the property of Allah in a real sense, and the property of any human being only in a figurative sense. And therefore, it should be used in a way that is sustainable and that honors the ownership, the true ownership right of Allah over all of existence. And that's why I have limits on what I can do. I can't just spend my time and live my life and spend my money however I want, because it's a gift from Allah. It's a trust from Allah and not my own property. That applies to something that exists in nature as well. So the idea that we have a maximum freedom, and the only time we run up against a limit on our freedom is when it constrains another person's freedom, as you'd find in an extreme capitalist society, is not accepted in Islam. Because my freedom does not run up against a wall when it constricts your freedom. My freedom runs up against a constraint when it goes against the rights that Allah has given me, the responsibilities that Allah has given me. So the focus is shifted there. And that's a general answer. We might get to some specifics in further questions, perhaps. The final question is about the freedom of movement. The Quran does say, "Alam takun ardullahi wasi'atan fatuhajiru fiha," when people are not able to practice their religion or live according to their conscience, then that is not an excuse. Allah's land is wide and expansive, and Allah says that then you should migrate. So that gives us a Quranic principle that we should seek to migrate to a land where we are able to live according to our conscience, where we are able to practice our religion with the minimum amount of constraints. However, Islam does recognize that there are certain limits that are to be placed on the economic and social interaction of different members of society in order to maintain stability and the existence of different cultural groups. In the classical period, this was often between the Bedouin and between the settled areas, the Arab, who were Bedouins, and the people who lived in cities, in mudun or qura, the settled areas. And that's because the settled areas often had a market economy, and the Bedouin areas, they often had a kind of tribal or a barter economy. And if they mixed too much, then what would often happen is that one would almost be overshadowed because of the economic power and the perhaps economic and political sophistication of the other. And that might mean that the settled population would take advantage of the Bedouin population. And so there are certain restrictions which are mentioned in Islamic law. They're good for historical reference for us. They're not necessarily relevant to us directly today, but they give us one example in Islamic law where there is a slight wall placed to prevent the settled population from overshadowing and eliminating the interests of the Bedouin population, and of course, vice versa. In our time, the overarching principle will be the greater good of society. And if the ma'asum, the imam, is going to be at the head of society, then the imam knows what is the maslahah and the overarching good. When the imam is not present to exercise authority, then it is individuals, it is jurists and Islamic scholars who have to make their best attempt to understand what is the greatest good of society and advocate for policies that ensure that greatest good. So when it comes to migration, the first principle is that the land belongs to Allah. We should not put restrictions on migration. However, unrestricted migration can cause economic upheaval. It can cause political upheaval. Today, for example, it can cause health concerns, the spread of a pandemic or other sicknesses, and therefore, in consultation with economic experts, in consultation with public health experts, in consultation with other stakeholders within society, a Muslim should advocate for policies that give a maximum amount of freedom of movement, but that ensure that health and the economic cohesion of society are not undermined. Right? Because, again, unhindered migration can result in capital flight and intellectual capital leaving certain societies. It can perhaps further oppressive political and economic relationships, and it can cause upheaval within society. And that is something that a moral person must engage with, but it requires trial and error. It requires humility. It requires an openness to hear different perspectives, maybe even try different policies, because if we don't have access to a ma'soom, then we can only do our best effort to try to understand what is the most just and the most constructive policy for us to advocate. And that might change as we grow and as we learn. So let me start from the last one. What would an Islamic economy look like? Again, as followers of Ahlul Bayt, we believe that the complete answer can only come from a ma'soom. So anything that I would say, anything that a jurist or a scholar will say will only be a provisional answer. It will be an attempt to move society in a moral direction from where we stand right now, but it doesn't make any claim to be the solution to the problem. That is something that can only come from the infallible knowledge of a ma'soom. So that doesn't mean it's useless, because if we stand at a certain crisis and we can even take one step in a moral direction, that's very valuable. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that we have it within our experience and our ability to cure the society. What will be there in an Islamic society? The basic needs of the most vulnerable will be met. The agency of individuals will be preserved. A focus will be given to strengthen not just individual freedom, but the ability of an individual to function in society as a moral being in order to establish a family, to be able to raise children. None of these will be compelled, but the policies of an Islamic economy or an Islamic polity should facilitate the ability of an individual to earn a livelihood, the ability of an individual to establish a family, and the growth rate may not be as great, because third focus will be on sustainability. So to be a steward of the environment, to be sustainable, is a focus of an Islamic economy. So just to give one example, so it's not fully theoretical, the kind of industrial or the kind of factory farming that we have today, whether it be with agriculture or whether it be with the way that livestock is raised and is slaughtered, that is immoral and that would not be permissible within Islam. That might mean that food will be a little bit more expensive. It might mean that meat will be more expensive, but the proper moral treatment of the earth, the moral treatment of the animals will be a responsibility, not just to maximize the amount of meat at the minimum price or at the greatest profit that would be accessible to people. So those would be some of the changes that would exist in an Islamic system. But again, to give a more complete answer, that would require the presence of a ma'soom. When it comes to the collection of Wealth, yes, we do have a hadith that great wealth that is collected cannot be there without the trampling of rights. Not all of those are legal ahadith, though. Remember that the Imams, they spoke of the requirements of Islamic law, but also the moral requirements of people. And if I have a great deal of wealth and my brother or my sister or my fellow believer is in need, then I should feel a responsibility to use that wealth to help them as well. So some of those ahadith are speaking to the individual to say that, look, if you have a great deal of wealth, then refer to your business practices, refer to how much charitable giving you have. Are you always prioritizing your own comfort and your own consumption and not the rights of your fellow believers, your community? Are you not sympathetic to those who are suffering? If that's the case, then do more for them. So the collection of great wealth is often the result of systematic failures in the economy or in politics, but it's often also the result of an individual self-centeredness. And some of those ahadith are referring primarily to that individual level, although the systematic level, as I covered earlier, is also important. Focusing on the primacy of the spiritual, does that lead to people being a burden on society? The answer to that is very simple. When Islam speaks of the primacy of the spiritual, remember, it's the spirit that's part of the body. And so the spiritual that I'm referring to is not just praying and fasting and ritual. The spiritual that I'm referring to is being responsible in society, working for the betterment of society. So a person is more spiritual if they are working a full-time job and just doing their wajib prayers, compared to a person who is living on charity but is doing wajib and mustahab prayers, recommended and non-obligatory prayers. Because spirituality is to honor the needs of the body, because the body is created by God, and to honor the needs of the soul, because the soul is created by God, and to honor their joint needs, because the soul and the body were connected by God in his wisdom. So no, the primacy of the spiritual will never allow a person to be a burden on society. If a person's a burden on society when they're able to work, then they are not spiritual. They are decidedly selfish. They are decidedly disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if it's beyond their control because they're sick, they're disabled, that's a separate issue. But if I can do something and I put myself as a burden on a family member or on society, then I'm not spiritual, even if I spend all my time in prayer. It's a selfish act, and it's an unspiritual act. When we say that there's collective responsibility, does that mean that societies will be held responsible? Yes, that's why we have a concept in Islamic law of wajib kifa'i, which is a collective responsibility. And that's why the Quran says, يَوْمَ نَدْعُ كُلَّ أُنَاسٍ بِإِمَامِهِمْ. On the Day of Judgment, every people will be called with their imam, meaning that they will be brought together in groups, in collectives, and the collective will be asked. And therefore, if I live in a very corrupt society, I have a greater responsibility to take a stand against that corruption. And if I have a good society that I live in, I have a responsibility to uphold those moral standards and strengthen those good moral practices that exist within society so they're not lost. We do have a collective existence and a collective responsibility, but that doesn't take away from the individual. So if I live in a corrupt society, economically exploitative, politically exploitative, and I do what I can do as an individual to try to advocate for what is fair, what is just, to live a fair and just life, then I'm not responsibility for the crime. And I'm not going to have a responsibility for the crimes of others. But that responsibility will be determined by what kind of society and what kind of collective I live in. And then the question of riba, and we have 1 minute left. This is a very detailed question, but very briefly. In reality, what Islam has done, according to the conventional understanding of riba, is that every asset has a rental value. So if I have a house, then I can rent the house, keep the ownership of the house and profit off of the house. I can rent out my car, keep the ownership of the car, and profit over time from the rental of the car. What Islam has said is that currency should not have a rental value. That currency should be invested and then I risk it, or I give it as a loan for the sake of Allah, but I return my principal. And that's why, according to some scholars, if I make a loan not with the intent of profit, but I have, a quote unquote nominal interest rate to maintain the purchasing power of that currency as a result of depreciation of a currency or as a result of inflation, then according to a number of our jurists and fuqaha, that is not riba, that's not interest, because that is not earning rent on your money, that is simply maintaining the purchasing power of your currency. So I've very much abbreviated that answer. I know that that raises many more questions, and inshallah we will have an opportunity to discuss that. But the conventional understanding, the majority understanding of the prohibition of interest in Islam is that it is the negation of the right of a person to earn a guaranteed rate of return on currency. In contrast to any other asset class, land, immovable property, movable property, where I do have a right to charge a rent or a fixed rate of return. And I think I will conclude there. I apologize if any of the answers were a little bit long-winded. Many of these were very detailed questions, and I know I was not able to do justice, but I hope that it raised some food for thought and inshallah provides a scope for further discussion, further research, and further appreciation of the moral force of the teachings that we have as a Muslim, that through contemplation and through effort, we can begin to practice better and be a force for justice and good within our societies. Wassalamu alaikum, and thank you for the opportunity.